Well, hello again, folks, and welcome to this, the second of our breakfast sessions. We started off with our first one yesterday, and this one here on climate change. I'm Malcolm Blaylock. I'm the Program Director of the Human Rights Arts and Film Festival. And the festival mainly shows films and visual arts. We have a lot of visual arts programs as well. And over the years, we've always had panels to discuss the films at the end of a lot of the films, and also question and answers. But what we decided to do this year was that there are a whole range of issues that are the issues of the day, and we just wanted to look at human rights in a general sense and look at some of the bigger issues that are out there in the human rights area, and climate change is certainly one of them. So this is why we've instituted the breakfast sessions, and we thank you very much for coming. Now, to introduce our panel who are going to discuss this today, we have Peter Ferguson on the end there. He's a lecturer in politics and policy studies. Peter Ferguson teaches global environmental politics, examining the ethical, political and institutional challenges raised by the global environmental crisis and the key policy and institutional responses. So, welcome. Michael Brown, on this end. His Associate Professor Michael Brown is an astronomer at Monash University with a strong interest in science and communication. He's a regular contributor to The Conversation and other media, and has written a number of articles on the origin and tactics of pseudoscience. His main involvement in climate change issue has been the debunking of climate contrarians, many of whom come from a libertarian background. He's also a very significant background of work in physics and astronomy. Welcome. Philip Sutton, he's the one left in the middle there, co-author of Climate Code Red and architect of the Victorian Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act. Philip Sutton is currently the manager of the Research and Strategy for Transition, a not-for-profit organisation focused on building social change and political commitments to transitioning to a sustainable economy. So I'd like to welcome the three panellists. And moderating today and asking the questions, we have Melissa Davey. She's a journalist with The Guardian. She has previously worked for Fairfax, including the Sydney Morning Herald and Sun Herald. She specialises in medical reporting, has undertaken further studies in epidemiology and biostatistics at the University of Sydney, and is passionate about helping researchers bring their important work to wider audiences. She has reported on the health impacts of climate change for The Guardian. And The Guardian is a supporter of the festival, and we thank them very much for that. So I now hand over to Melissa to get the discussion going.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming out to talk about this important issue with us this morning. Well, governments have traditionally approached climate change as an ecological problem and certainly as an economic one, but our changing climate is obviously a human rights issue as well. Australia is one of the most arid continents in the world. It's vulnerable to disruptions in water supply, to floods, drought, storms, and all of these things can obviously impact on access to water, access to food, and contribute to the spread of disease. International Alert, a UK-based non-government organisation, has identified 46 countries where the impacts of climate change will create a high risk of violent conflict and potentially jeopardise human rights. So the Climate Change Challenges to Health report, released by the Australian Academy of Science last month, warned that vulnerable people, particularly the sick, elderly and poor, are particularly vulnerable to the worst impacts of climate change. Perhaps I'll start with Dr. Peter Ferguson. Australia is a signatory to the major international human rights conventions. Does our government then have an obligation to tackle climate change given it poses a human rights threat?
Well, yes, obviously. But we don't tend to take obligations under the Human Rights Convention seriously in other areas too, so I guess that's hardly a unique problem. We're also a signatory to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has obligations built into it for us to, all signatories, to reduce emissions to a level which would provide a sustainable and stable climate. And depending on what happens in Paris, at the end of this year, we may be the signatory to a legally binding agreement to reduce our emissions. So yeah, we have international law obligations. I think it's clear that we have ethical obligations as well. But we're certainly not playing our part proportionally. We're the highest per capita emitter in the world, even higher than the US. And you often hear that our emissions, well, they're only 1.5% to perhaps 2% of total global emissions. But we've been doing this like many other developed countries for 150 years. So we've had the historical benefit of high energy consumption and fossil fuel energy consumption. We're also emitting more tonnes of CO2 per man, woman and child than the other country, and certainly it's 4 or 5 times more than China, for example. And the other thing we do, which no one wants to talk about, well, I mean, the environment movement talks about it now, but the two major parties won't, is that we export an immense amount of coal. We control about 1/3 of the global coal trade, and the emissions impacts of that coal being burnt, wherever it's being burnt, dwarf our domestic emissions here by could be almost 8 or 9%. Others might know 8 or 9 times. Others might know the figures exactly. So there's responsibilities there too, which we're not taking seriously.
So given those statistics that you've just told us about, how do we, consolidate that with the fact that we have just appointed Bjorn Lomborg to head a climate consensus centre? Obviously, Lomborg is a climate contrarian. So, given that, how do we convince the Prime Minister to engage with the science and accept that climate change is not just real, but that it poses a real human rights threat?
All I'll say on that is no one's probably going to convince Tony Abbott of that. But yeah, I mean, it's incredible that the government is putting millions of dollars into Lomborg at the same time they're stripping science funding from real science. It's quite a shame. But
Phil, Michael, I mean, do you agree with that? How do we, accept the fact that we have Lomborg now given millions of dollars to set up this centre at the same time as we're trying to get people to understand that climate change is a human rights and health issue?
I mean, the Lomborg appointment does have to be seen as sort of a political act rather than genuine research at the University of Western Australia, and the fact that University of Western Australia has withdrawn its offer to host Lomborg is a very good sign on that front. But you're not going to necessarily convince people who don't believe in climate change to believe in climate change if they're very, very committed to it. It's a political belief system, and you're about as likely to convince them of changing their views on climate change as you're going to convince someone from, say, the far left to join the far right using facts. It's a political position, not a scientific one. And they were putting Lomborg out there, I think, to just try and convince undecided people that action on climate change isn't needed.
Perhaps I'll ask Philip as well to weigh in on, how would you engage with someone like Lomborg?
I tend not to spend much time sort of trying to engage with people who are dedicated, not scientific skeptics in a proper sense, but just sort of, opponents of action on climate change for a range of reasons. I think that there's a large number of other people in the community that we need to reach sort of ahead of them effectively.
Well, Australia has experienced its warmest and third warmest years on record in 2013 and 2014 and has warmed 0.9 degrees since 1910. Michael, you're well aware that there are people out there who dispute that this is the case. What have you learned from taking on climate change deniers or climate change contrarians, or as some people might call them, the trolls?
Yeah. So I've learned a couple of things. So, I mean, the key one is that while they will argue it as if they're arguing a scientific case, it is primarily a political case. So if you look at some of the most prominent climate bloggers in Australia, they're often very openly libertarian or very hard right in their views, and they're very open about that. And they'll argue it as if they're arguing a scientific case, but it really is a political case. So you're not going to be necessarily changing their minds. You also find that there's a nice they have a sort of desire for things to be simple. So you often find, for instance, in climate change, that there's retired engineers who sort of desire a time when you could fix your own car. And so they want to sort of reduce climate change to something that's very simple. Let me find some data and draw a line through it and that's what climate change is. And it's much more complicated than that, and you'll never convince them that it is more complicated than that. And then you do get, under the surface, the conspiracy theory element. So certainly you find people like, say, Jennifer Marahasi, who is a source of stories in the Australian newspaper. You know, she actually has said straight out that she believes that people at the Bureau of Meteorology should go to jail. You know, and this is a real conspiracy theory angle, that there's people deliberately manipulating data to produce climate change.
I mean, on Friday, Tony Abbott's business advisor, Maurice Newman, wrote in The Australian that the United Nations was using debunked climate change science to lead a new world order.
Yeah, and that's just straight out tinfoil hattery. So there is that element definitely running underneath the surface of the climate change denial movement. The interesting thing is, say, in some newspapers that gets moderated out. So some of the more extreme beliefs get moderated away. So for instance, Jennifer Marahasi's desire for the Bureau of Meteorology scientists to go to jail, that's not something that necessarily the Australian runs with in its newspaper pages.
Peter, your research has examined the security implications of climate change. And
Before I talk about that, can I talk about
Please do.
this one thing?
Yeah.
I mean, this lunatic fringe is part of the problem, but I think also part of the problem, and I would also class those who say they accept the science, they accept the IPCC reports as being true and accurate, but these people can also be deniers because the response that they suggest is completely disproportionate for the science. So when someone like Kevin Rudd gets up and says, I accept the science, climate change is the greatest moral challenge humanity faces, and then proposes a 5% reduction in emissions by 2020, which is nowhere near in line with the science, I mean, you're effectively denying the validity of the science doing that as well. So politicians who say they're concerned about this and then propose to do nothing, which is basically what the Labor Party has been doing for the last 10, 15 years, with a few exceptions, are actually just as bad as those who deny the science flat out. So it's a different kind of denial, and that's probably a home truth that some people don't want to face either. So one other thing that's just struck in my mind about the way not only perceiving the problem is important, admitting to the problem, but perceiving the solution is also important. There was a wonderful experiment run by the Harvard psychologist Daniel Kahneman a few years ago, and he got a group of conservative right-wing US Republicans and put them in a room with climate scientists. And the climate scientists gave the standard rundown of the science as it was at that point. We've got a serious problem, it's going to have all these terrible effects, so on and so forth. Then they split the group in half, and half went into one room where a policy expert said, now the solutions to these problems are that we've got to drastically reduce our emissions by increasing carbon, putting in carbon taxes, carbon trading, rationing petrol, all these kind of very quite punitive responses. The other group went into a room with a so-called expert who said, no, the solution is more nuclear power, deregulation of the power industry, selling national parks to private companies so that they can kind of manage that land in an environmentally sensitive way, and so on and so forth. They then asked each group, okay, how serious is the problem? Remember, these were, quite right-wing American conservatives. The group who'd gone and heard about the carbon taxes and the regulation and the petrol rationing said, oh, it's not a serious problem at all. The group who'd gone and heard about nuclear power, deregulation of the power industry, selling national parks, were quite prepared to admit there was a problem. So it works both ways in terms of how you perceive the solution as to how you perceive the problem. And it's all politics, it's not science in that case. Yeah.
So just following on from that, I mean, do researchers need to start communicating better with governments? Is it the researchers, are they failing to engage and to get their science across, or is it a lack of political will? Are politicians the ones failing to listen? I mean, Philip, maybe that's one for you.
Yeah, I sort of tend to think about Australia as being the coal equivalent of Saudi Arabia. And if we were thinking about Saudi Arabia and saying, why is it that the politicians there, the decision makers are sort of biased towards the oil industry, you wouldn't be at all surprised. And so I think that for us to sort of have a naive view of politics where we sort of say, okay, we'll just go and lobby the current government or whoever the current government is, and that in itself will be the answer, I think we're missing the point that it's they're very powerful forces that want to favour fossil fuel development, and so they will tend to try and skew things in that direction. So if we want to have an impact, which of course we must do, then I think we have to actually build a very strong level of support within our community. So I think that rather than spending our time just going straight to the politicians and lobbying them, it's about time we actually lobbied our own citizens, our own fellow Australians, and actually got them on side and realised that in the longer term, I mean, even in Saudi Arabia, they realise the oil will run out at some stage and they'll have to have something else. So they're investing quite actively in renewable energy, unlike Australia. So we should be going to our citizens and saying it's actually not in our interests to be held to ransom by the current incumbents who dominate our economy, and that we for economic and social and environmental reasons, we actually need a change. So that's what I would do. I would not so much be blaming the politicians who are, you know, the current government federally is the government of the fossil fuel industry. The Labor Party is the government of the fossil fuel industry plus other things. And so that they try to have a bit each way. So they'll support renewable energy, but they don't want to close down fossil fuels. So we have to get to the point where we have sufficiently strong commitment by the community to say we need a paradigm shift and we've just got to make it happen.
So maybe a question for all the panellists. Which countries are addressing the security implications and the health implications quite well, and what can we learn from those countries?
Well, I'll talk about security, if you like. Obama in America is now, I mean, it looks like climate change might be what he's trying to make his legacy on. He's got to find something, I guess, in the last bit of time allocated to him. And as I mentioned before, there's a big meeting in Paris to try and negotiate a successor to the Kyoto Protocol in December. What's actually happening in the US has been quite interesting, because the Department of Defence there, and this actually goes back to the Bush era, believe it or not, has been taking climate change very seriously in terms of it being what they call a threat multiplier in terms of strategic risks, and that is perhaps not in terms of multiplying the threat of a great power war, but definitely the threats of humanitarian problems and unrest in unstable parts of the world. And of course the Arab Spring was partly attributed to bread prices, which were derived partly from the drought in Russia before that, which is possibly a climate cause, excuse me. But the Department of Defence, so is obviously factoring in climate as a strategic issue, but they're also reducing their operational emissions a huge amount. They've got the biggest arrays of renewable energy infrastructure now in the United States, actually on defence land and things like that. And the US defence establishment is really kind of wagging the climate policy tail of the climate policy dog, if you like, in the US. And the outgoing, what is now gone, Chuck Hagel, the Secretary of Defence, was going around the world lobbying governments and other military establishments to take climate change seriously. This is the same Chuck Hagel who sponsored a resolution in the Senate, the US Senate, in the late 1990s, which prevented the US ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, basically. So he's had a kind of... he and many other conservative military types have had a transition there. The UK also, and Germany and the EU and other countries, NATO even, are taking this seriously. And I think Australia is too, but they don't talk about it.
Anyone else want to jump in there? Leave that one alone.
Yeah.
Well, last month I interviewed Nobel laureate of medicine, Professor Peter Doherty, and he was at an international climate change conference in Hong Kong at the time, talking to policymakers around the world, and he said to me that Australia was turning into public enemy number one of the UN climate change talks happening in December. Do you all agree with that, and is it too late for us to change that worldview of how we're being perceived on tackling climate change?
The way to change our perception of Australia is to get a different government. So that's the crucial thing. I mean, any country will be seen internationally by the actions that its governments take. So Canada, for example, is a world leader in the same sort of retrograde actions as Australia. I mean, but it's not surprising because they're both resource-intensive economies and haven't realised that they are going to have to make this shift. So I think that, I mean, I don't think we can change perceptions by perception management. I think all we can do is change perceptions because we have changed. We've done something different. And that will require a lot of work to actually get, as I said before, I'm just kind of repeating myself in a way. I mean, once we can get Australians to realise our economic and social interest and environmental interests are in a change in the economy, then that can start to feed through the politics. And I think we have to, just to take a different tack on this, I think that one of the problems around the world, and particularly in Australia and the US, is that environmentalism is seen as a left-wing activity. And that was not the case 40 years ago. When I was sort of a young environmental activist at Sydney University, you couldn't tell what a person's politics were going to be just because they said they were interested in the environment. And the same applied in Victoria. So there has been this cultural shift. And I think what's happened is that we tend now to see it as a case of, well, the left are sort of interested and we now have to get the moderate right to come across. Whereas another way of looking at it is, what would happen if every different strand of politics tried to take this on? So when you look at the polling, you'll find that, let's say on the left, 60% of the people might be concerned about climate. And on the right, there's only, say, 20%. And you think, isn't that disgusting? But those 20% of those people are gold. They're people on the right who actually get it. So the thing is that what we should be doing is encouraging everybody in all their different political silos to actually start to take this issue on. And so the reason why we're weak on the right is partly polarisation on a left-right basis, but it's partly just the sheer lack of work. There hasn't been the campaigning. Like left-wing campaigners campaign amongst left-wingers. They don't campaign actively so much amongst people that they don't relate to that well. And so what we see is the lack of action on the right is due to a lack of action. Does that make sense? Like a lack of campaigning. Now, we have a problem now, which is how do you change that? And some of us are going to have to step across political divides and be prepared to talk to people whose politics we don't agree with. But we have to actually start to facilitate all elements of politics to take this issue on in ways that make sense to those people. And I mean, your work on security is a classic example because, I mean, you just gave Chuck Hagel as an example. Realist right-wingers, I mean, there's the fantasy right wing and there's the realist right wing. The realists will eventually get this issue. And what we have to do is facilitate their early engagement so that they can actually take it on, and then they become advocates within their own community.
Peter, you seem itching to jump in there.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's I guess a trite observation to look at the links between conservatism and conservation, but you look at European conservative governments, the two climate leaders are probably Germany, led by a centre-right conservative government, and the UK, still led by a conservative government. Going back to Australia's international reputation on this, it's abysmal and has been for two decades. And I just point at two things that are often missed. At the Kyoto negotiations, which was the first attempt to get a legally binding agreement in 1997, Australia was afforded a 108% target, so an 8% increase on our emissions. And there were also some very generous provisions put in that agreement to allow avoided emissions from deforestation. So actually, if you stop cutting down trees, you would be given credits effectively. That was only put into the agreement because Australia threatened to walk away. That was under the Howard government. So that was our first shameful event. The second one, there's probably more, but in Copenhagen, when Kevin Rudd and the Labor Prime Minister went over there and was, talking about his great moral challenge and all of those kind of things, well, you look at the morals of what Australia did there. They lobbied and they bullied and they pressured those countries who were angling for a target, a temperature increase target of only 1.5 degrees. These were the countries of small island states who will be inundated if the temperature rises by any more of that than that. Rudd and his diplomats went around and strong-armed these small, vulnerable countries into not pushing that 1.5 degree target and instead wanted to push the 2 degree target. So we're talking about a human rights issue here, an ethical issue, or Australia actually working against meaningful action at the global level. There's another example which I think is pretty shameful.
Do you want to weigh in on that?
I mean, coming from as an actual working scientist, the radiative transfer and weather stations and tide gauges aren't left-right things. They're things, and the science of climate change shouldn't actually be a left-right issue. It's it's science, and it has its uncertainties, it has its issues, but it's science. It's not a sort of political issue. The policy responses, that definitely can be a political issue. I think perhaps part of the path forward is that there may be events which are very, very clearly related to climate change that have a very broad impact across the community, and that might break some of the partisan divide. And certainly you can sort of see the impact of that and say the ebb and flow of the, let's say, the anti-vaccination movement, that that's sort of built up in some areas of our society, but sort of with, unfortunately, some pretty horrible events, that is starting to, I would say, recede because people can see its very clear impact on our communities. And unfortunately, we might need some grim or disturbing action from climate change that breaks that political divide and results in people taking it more seriously at the political level.
So that's quite a dire thing to think, isn't it? That we need some massive, awful, horrendous event here in Australia before governments will act seriously. And particularly, you could argue that those events are already happening. Is there a disconnect between associating those events, flood and drought, earthquakes, with climate change? And is it just too abstract for people to relate to climate change?
I think it's not necessarily abstract, but often the message is complicated, and often a very simple message carries a lot of power. We've seen elections that have been fought on, 5-word slogans, and for the vaccination debate, unfortunately, there's a fairly grim slogan there that communicates the problem very clearly. There are diseases that kill children, and that has obvious impact for all the right reasons. If you start discussing bushfire risk, then you've got, bushfires have always happened, but the risk of bushfires and the intensity of bushfires is increased by climate change, and that's a much more nuanced and complicated message. And perhaps, unfortunately, we'll need some disaster or some event, some truly horrible drought, perhaps associated with an El Nino event, that really communicates how significant and damaging climate change is, not just to the environment, but to our economy.
Yes, please.
Yeah. I think the problem with relying on disasters is that disasters get interpreted by people in the framework that they're already thinking. So, for example, in whatever year it was, 1600 and something, the city of Lisbon was almost completely destroyed in Portugal due to a tsunami. And nobody was talking about, tectonic plates and geology and, sort of earth movements. What they were talking about was who had sinned, who had brought the wrath of God upon the people of Lisbon. And their whole debate was who was most to blame for God's wrath being visited upon them. Now, you roll that through to sort of 20-something or other in San Francisco, and the city falls apart because of the earthquake. Now, in this case, people's understanding of the issue of the causation of earthquakes had changed in the meantime, and so they spent time talking about the San Andreas Fault and the physical geological causations. Now, what happens at the moment is that people are very loath to talk, politicians and our community groups are quite loath to talk to the public about the connection between the exacerbation of extreme weather events and climate change, even though the scientific information around this is now very, very solid. There's been great work done by Peter Caroli and a whole bunch of other scientists on attributing what proportion or what sort of dimension of these extreme events is influenced by climate change. Now, just imagine if you have people who won't make the connection and won't talk about it, and then the community faces a disaster. What do? At the time of disaster, you want to solve the problem. You want to protect people and save them, all the rest of it. You want to think about rebuilding your homes. You don't want to think about the fact that this disaster is going to come back and hit you again in another 5 or 6 or 10 years. So people tend to want to turn away from the issue at that point. But what would happen if the politicians or other community leaders got up and said, no, there is a connection. It's quite clear. Climate makes this worse. It is getting worse. Here's the evidence. We can point to the insurance data and all that. And they just simply provided leadership. most of the issues in our life, everything's complicated. How many people know how to make an iPad or an iPhone? You know, like we all use these things, but we don't know anything about how they work. But the thing is that I
do want to tap in though. I mean, one thing that is important there is, you know, while I agree with the sort of the framework does matter, the actual percentage of people who don't believe there's any connection between CO2 emissions and climate is actually relatively modest. They're quite good at getting their message out there, but it's actually a relatively modest portion of the total population. It is a significant portion of some political parties, but it's actually a relatively modest portion of the overall population. There's a lot of people out there who believe in it but don't necessarily believe it's that big a deal. There's a lot of people who do believe in it and believe it's a very big deal. But it's the actual rump that thinks there's no relationship between CO2 and climate is actually quite modest. So that is a good sign, but it's not enough to make things happen.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that what happens is we're a social species. We look over our shoulder to see what other people are doing. If we don't see concerted leadership, then we tend to say, well, two things. One is that either the problem doesn't exist or it's going to be so hard to fix it. Like if the leaders won't tackle it, how am I supposed to tackle it? And so we go back onto our normal lives. If we want to get this change, we have to start getting more public leadership. You know, we have to get out into the public more and speak more openly and publicly, and then we have to also encourage people to join political parties. Like, if we don't have good representatives in the Labor Party or the Liberal Party, go and, if you can bear it, go and join the parties and get them to... The Greens Party is already on side. People often say, you know, politicians don't care, the Greens do care. So we just need to show evidence that there's concern about this issue across the political spectrum, and then once you can see that the whole society's starting to take it seriously, then people will be prepared to take action. So I don't think that we're hopeless. I think that we're just sort of in this pre-action mode where we're looking around, you know, are the signals right that we should step up and really do something?
Peter, I'll get you to weigh in on that just shortly. I just want to say that we will be going to questions in a few minutes, so if you could start thinking about some questions you'd like to ask our panellists, and just remember to try and keep it to a question and not a statement. Peter, do you want to...
I think these issues of political leadership are really important, and in fact, I think political leadership, particularly at the higher levels, is far more important than mass understanding of the science. I mean, if you look at other very major and radical policy changes in direction in this country, the floating of the dollar, deregulation of finance, the scrapping of tariffs, and then all of that, the effect that had in terms of changing the composition of the Australian economy and certainly the way society was organised, far more radical than the implications of moving to 100% renewable energy in terms of, you know, the change in production patterns and the disruption to many communities and things like that, manufacturing communities. The great general public had really no detailed understanding of the economic rationale for those changes, some of which was actually pretty dubious in my view. But there was strong leadership that pushed that through. And if we had a similar sort of strong leadership around climate, it wouldn't matter if people didn't have a detailed understanding of the science, as long as they could see that, for whatever reason, the leaders who are leading us thought this was in the best interest of the country. I think it would be a lot easier.
So just before I throw to questions, it sounds like what you're saying is that, you know, we shouldn't necessarily be waiting for the politicians for leadership. What can people do if people are listening today and they feel like they want to become more involved and they care about the human rights implications of climate change and that kind of thing? What do you suggest people do?
Well, think about who you vote for to start. Don't vote for a party who says they care about the issue and then proposes very minimal responses. So that's obviously a barb at the ALP. But, you know, it's a fact. You can't claim
but neither of the major parties seem to have really been taking any strong leadership on this.
Well,
if
look,
you could say the Labor Party's talking the talk.
Well, to give the Liberals credit, at least they're honest about not doing anything. Labor pretends they're you know, you vote for Liberals, you're getting climate policy. You vote for Labor, well, who knows? They've got a national conference coming up in Melbourne in a month or two where this issue will be debated, but, you know, goodness knows how that will translate into policy on the ground. I think they feel that in those swinging seats in Western Sydney and suburban Melbourne, this isn't an issue, and they've got to play a small target. And if that means losing votes to the Greens in the inner city, well, they'll wear that. It seems to be their approach. So that's my advice.
So thank you very much for coming. Thank you again for the panel. Thanks very much.